Hi guys, welcome back to MedUSMLE. I'm Michele Persico, incoming PGY1 at Emory University, and today we are going to talk about epidemiological studies, a high-yield topic for biostatistics for the USMLE Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3. So let's get started. So this slide gives you a general overview of all the types of studies a researcher can do in epidemiology. Keep in mind that first aid for step 1 has a limited list of the epidemiological studies you can see on the USMLE, whereas this slide gives you all the possible studies you can be tested on. So there are two fundamental different types of study designs, which are the experimental studies in which the researcher intervenes and sees what's the effect of the intervention on the study subjects, and on the other hand we have the observational studies. In the observational studies, the subjects are observed and there is no action from the researcher. Now, the typical experimental study are the clinical trials. So, in clinical trials, the study is designed with a group that receives the treatment, which is also known as treatment group, and the treatment group receives the experimental treatment, whereas the control group receives the standard treatment or the placebo. So the researcher follows the patients a long time and measures certain parameters, which are called endpoints, to determine if the treatment is considered effective or not. For example, if a trial tests a new antihypertensive drug, the endpoint analyzed at patient follow-up will likely be blood pressure. Now, considering the observational studies, we can have two types of study designs. One in which there is the comparison group, and in this case are the cohort, the case control, cross-sectional and ecological studies, and another type in which the comparison group is absent. In this case, these studies are the case series and the case report. So, in case series and case report is generally the description of atypical or unique clinical cases. In case series, generally described multiple patients, so two or more than two patients, whereas in case report is generally described just one clinical case, so just one patient. So, for the ecological studies, the difference from the cohort, case control and the cross-sectional studies is based on the type of patients that are analyzed. So for the ecological studies, it's actually the entire population of a nation that is analyzed, whereas in case of cohort studies, case control studies, or cross-sectional studies, it's generally a population sample. And this is a big difference to distinguish from the ecological studies. Although I can understand that ecological studies are complex to interpret, especially in questions. So I have prepared a few questions at the end of this video so that you can better master and understand what I mean in practical, that the ecological studies are studies that are done at a population level. So in the next slide, I'm going to give you like a little tip about a certain type of study design which is low yield and it's not required that you know for the USMLE preparation. So an important note is that the first aid for the USMLE Step 1 mentioned also two concordant studies. I have never found questions on the USMLE in which this was the correct answer, and personally I don't recall it as being listed among the answer choices. So don't stress too much about learning this type of study, as it is never the correct answer. Also, in the very unlikely possibility you will find it among the answer choices. In the next slide, I'm going to show you how to differentiate case control, cohort studies, and cross-sectional studies on test day. So, to understand epidemiological studies, you have to keep in mind the 10 criteria as the most important one. In cohort studies, the researcher follows a long time a cohort of patients with certain risk factors to see if this risk factor lead to development of a certain outcome, which is generally a disease. So for example, a researcher follows a group of hypertensive or non-hypertensive patients a long time to see which one develops a stroke. The statistical unit of measure for these studies is the relative risk also known as incidence ratio, which is the incidence of disease in people exposed to the risk factor divided by the incidence of disease in people not exposed to the risk factor. Now, an important difference that can show up on questions is the difference between prospective cohort studies and retrospective cohort studies. So, to understand the difference, we can start from an example. So, in prospective cohort studies, we have to keep in mind that the present time is 2023, so we live in 2023, and the study start date is always in the same time of the present time, so in this case 2023. So the researcher in 2023 has a cohort of patients that he identifies and for which defines which one has hypertension and which one doesn't have hypertension. And so then he follows this patient a long time and he sets a study end date of 2025. So basically he will follow the patients for other 2 years, and the researcher will identify which one of these patients will develop a stroke in the period 2023 and 2025. So the important point is that in prospective cohort studies, the present time, so the time we live in, is the same time of the study start date. Whereas in retrospective cohort studies, the present time is the time we live in and the study start date is 1995. In this case, in this example, so it's a time which is the past compared to the present time. So the researcher identifies the cohort of patients in 1995 that's hypertension and that doesn't have hypertension, and then follows these patients forward in time until the set study end date, which is 2005. So as you can see, in this case, the researcher follows these cohort of patients always forward in time, but the time frame is between 1995 and 2005, so it's shifted in the past. That's why it's called the retrospective cohort studies, but the direction is always forward in time. So the opposite of a cohort study is a case control study. In case control studies, the researcher identifies patients with a disease and control patients without a disease, and then it goes backward in time to identify which patients was exposed to a certain risk factor. For example, in this example that I have provided to you, so the study start date is 2023, and the researcher identifies patients with and without chronic myeloid leukemia. Then the researcher identified patients exposed to chemo between 2023 and 2020. So as you can see, it goes backward in time with the study end date in 2020. So the statistical unit of measure of this type of studies, so case control studies, is the odds ratio, which is the odds of developing the disease divided by the odds on not developing the disease. Now, the last type of studies we have to talk about are cross-sectional and ecological studies. Speaking metaphorically, to understand this type of study, you have to consider that these studies are a snapshot of the population in a certain period of time. So let's imagine in the example that I have provided to you that the study start and end date is between 2021 and 2025. So it's still a period of time, but the researcher doesn't go backward and forward in time. It just takes the patients that have the risk factors, the patients that have the disease, and then calculates a statistical unit of measure, which is the prevalence ratio, which is defined by the division between the prevalence of the disease in exposed patients divided by the prevalence of disease in patients not exposed to the risk factor. So as you can see, the prevalence is the number of patients with the disease divided by the total population. And that's interesting because there is no, in the definition of prevalence, there is no time criteria, which means that there is no following a long time a cohort of patients to identify which patients develop a disease, which is, on the other hand, the definition of incidence, because the incidence is the number of new cases between time 0 and time 1 divided by the number of patients at risk for developing a certain disease at the start of the study, so at time 0. So as you can see, the incidence implies that you have to find a long time the patients that develops the disease, because it's the summation, the sum of the all new cases in the time period considered, whereas the prevalence is just the number of cases in the time frame considered, not the new cases, just the number of all the cases, so of all the patients with the disease in the period considered. So for example, in this case, between 2021 and 2025. So cross-sectional and ecological studies imply a static situation, a static approach in which there is no movement of backward or forward in time, whereas for retrospective cohort studies and prospective cohort studies and case control studies, it's more like a movie, because the researcher goes backward in time in case control studies, whereas goes forward in cohort studies. And so this is a general overview of the different types of observational studies that are more likely the most difficult ones you can encounter on test day. So in the next video, I will provide to you an easy step-by-step approach on how to solve each types of observational studies. So stay tuned for more information about that I will post later in the week. So until next time, thank you so much for watching, guys, and hope you liked the video, and please subscribe and hit the like button, and see you next time.